A dark puddle in the dirt served as the very first warning. In the unforgiving valleys of the Colorado Territory, a dying woman on a forgotten trail wasn't a tragedy, it was a trap. But Jeremiah couldn't ride away. Saving her was instinct. Surviving the storm she brought with her, that would require a miracle. Dust devils danced across the arid expanse of the lower basin, kicking up grit that stung Jeremiah's weather-beaten face. It was the autumn of 1881, and the Rockies were already whispering promises of a brutal winter. Jeremiah Cross, a man built like the mountains he inhabited, broad-shouldered, scarred, and silent, was making his final descent to the trading post before the snows locked him in his high-altitude sanctuary. His pack mule trailed behind his Appaloosa, burdened with pelts that represented a year of solitary survival. He didn't like the lowlands. The air down here smelled of greed, coal smoke, and desperation. Up in his cabin near the timberline, the world made sense. You respected the elements, and in turn, they allowed you to live. Down here, men killed each other over lines drawn on paper maps. Jeremiah pulled his rifle from its scabbard when his horse, an irritable gelding named Barnaby, suddenly halted and pinned his ears back. A low, nervous whinny broke the silence of the canyon. Jeremiah's sharp gray eyes scanned the brush. Coyotes? A mountain lion? Then he saw it. A patch of ivory fabric, stark and unnatural against the rust-colored earth, lay crumpled in the dry riverbed at the bottom of a steep embankment. Jeremiah dismounted, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. As he slid down the rocky slope, the shape resolved into a horrifying reality. It was a woman. She lay twisted on her side, half buried under a tumble of loose rocks and dead sagebrush. Her clothes, what was left of them, were made of fine eastern silk, completely incongruous with the raw savagery of the frontier. The fabric was shredded, soaked through with dark, drying blood. Jeremiah dropped to his knees. The scent of copper hit him hard. He had seen the aftermath of barroom brawls, mining camp riots, and bear attacks, but the brutality inflicted upon this woman made his stomach turn. Her face was a canvas of purple bruises and lacerations, swollen almost beyond recognition. Her lip was split, and a deep gash ran along her hairline, matting her auburn hair into a dark, sticky halo. Whoever did this hadn't just wanted to kill her, they had wanted her to suffer. He reached out, his thick, calloused fingers pressing gently against the side of her throat, searching for a pulse amid the cold, pale skin. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the howling wind whipping through the canyon. Then, a flutter. Faint, erratic, like the wings of a dying moth. "God Almighty," Jeremiah muttered, his voice a gravelly rasp that hadn't been used in weeks. He couldn't leave her. The nearest town, a miserable collection of tents and saloons called Oakhaven, was 10 miles away. She wouldn't survive the ride strapped to a saddle, and the local doctor was a drunken butcher who was more likely to bleed her out than save her. His cabin was closer, though the trail was treacherous. Jeremiah stripped off his heavy buffalo hide coat and wrapped it tightly around her frail, shivering form. When he lifted her, she weighed no more than a bundle of dry kindling. A pained, breathless whimper escaped her cracked lips, but her eyes remained firmly shut. "Hold on, girl," he whispered, marching back up the embankment. He secured her sideways in his saddle, tying her gently but firmly with his lariat so she wouldn't slip. For the next 3 hours, Jeremiah walked ahead of the horse, leading them up the narrow, winding switchbacks into the biting cold of the upper peaks. Every stumble of the horse made him wince, fearing the jolt would extinguish the fragile spark of life left in her. By the time they reached the clearing where his log cabin stood, the sky had bruised into a deep, stormy violet. The wind was howling, carrying the first icy flakes of snow. Jeremiah carried her inside, kicking the heavy oak door shut against the storm. The cabin was spartan: a stone hearth, a cast-iron stove, a heavy wooden table, and a single bed covered in wolf pelts. He laid her on the bed, immediately stoking the dying embers in the hearth, until a roaring fire pushed the freezing chill from the room. The real work began. He fetched a bucket of water from the indoor pump he had rigged from the nearby spring and set it to boil. He tore clean linen shirts into strips. When he gently cut away the ruined remnants of her silk dress to clean her wounds, the true horror of her beating was revealed. Her ribs were a landscape of black and yellow. At least 2 felt fractured beneath his careful probing. Defensive wounds marred her forearms. As he washed the dried blood from her neck, a heavy silver chain caught his eye. Attached to it was a locket, intricately engraved with the initials A.M. He popped it open. Inside was a small, faded photograph of a stern-looking older man, and tucked behind it, a folded piece of paper the size of a postage stamp. Jeremiah didn't read it. He snapped the locket shut and tucked it beneath her pillow. For 3 days and 3 nights, Jeremiah did not sleep. The woman burned with a fever that threatened to consume her. She thrashed in the grip of terrifying nightmares, crying out in a voice hoarse from screaming. "Don't. Please, Nathaniel." The ledger. "I burned it," she would beg invisible phantoms, her hands clawing at the thick pelts. Jeremiah sat beside her, constantly wiping her brow with cool, damp cloths, forcing drops of water and bone broth past her lips. He applied poultices of yarrow and pine sap to her lacerations to stave off infection, old remedies taught to him by a Ute elder a decade ago. He listened to her delirious ravings, piecing together fragments of a dark, twisted puzzle. Nathaniel, the ledger, the fire. Jeremiah was a man who had fled to the mountains to escape the cruelty of the world, but as he watched this broken woman fight for every breath, he realized the world had followed him up the mountain. And whoever Nathaniel was, he was a man who left loose ends. Loose ends that Jeremiah was now tying back together. The fever broke on the morning of the 4th day. Jeremiah was at the cast-iron stove, flipping a pan of salt pork, when he heard a sharp, ragged gasp from the bed. He turned slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening. She was sitting bolt upright, the heavy wolf pelts clutched to her chest. Her eyes, a striking, vivid emerald green, were wide with absolute terror. She looked around the rustic, shadowy cabin, her gaze darting to the mounted elk antlers, the rifles racked by the door, and finally, to the massive, bearded man standing by the stove. She scrambled backward until her shoulders hit the log wall, wincing in agony as her fractured ribs protested the sudden movement. "Where am I?" Her voice was a cracked whisper. "Where is he?" Jeremiah set the pan down. "You're safe," he said, his tone low and resonant, like distant thunder. "You're high up in the San Juan Mountains. Name's Jeremiah Cross. I found you down in the basin, 3 days past. You were in a bad way." The woman stared at him, her chest heaving. She raised a trembling hand to her face, her fingertips grazing the swollen bruises and the neat stitches Jeremiah had placed along her hairline. The memory of the violence seemed to crash into her all at once. A silent sob shook her frame, and she squeezed her eyes shut. "My name," she started, her voice shaking, "is Abigail. Abigail Montgomery." "Well, Abigail Montgomery," Jeremiah said, pouring a cup of hot black coffee and walking it over to a small stool near the bed. He set it down and stepped back, giving her space. "You're lucky the coyotes didn't find you before I did. Or maybe they did, and decided you didn't have enough meat on your bones." It was a poor attempt at humor, but it served its purpose. The sheer absurdity of the statement made Abigail open her eyes. She looked at the coffee, then at Jeremiah. Slowly, agonizingly, she reached out and took the tin cup. The warmth seemed to ground her. "Who did this to you, Abigail?" Jeremiah asked, leaning against the heavy oak table. Abigail stiffened. Her emerald eyes dropped to the dark liquid in her cup. "Bandits," she lied, the word tumbling out too quickly. "My stagecoach was ambushed. They took everything. Beat me. Left me for dead." Jeremiah studied her. He had lived long enough to know when someone was terrified of the truth. "Bandits," he repeated slowly. "Bandits usually take the valuables. They don't normally leave a heavy silver locket around a woman's neck." Abigail's free hand shot to her throat, her fingers frantically searching until she felt the familiar metal. A look of profound relief washed over her, followed immediately by guarded suspicion. "And," Jeremiah continued, crossing his arms, "bandits don't usually go by the name of Nathaniel, or care much about a ledger." The color drained entirely from Abigail's face. The tin cup rattled against her teeth as her hands shook. You went through my things. You listened to me. You were screaming with a fever, Abigail. Hard not to listen." Jeremiah sighed, the gruffness fading from his voice. "Look, I don't care about your past. I don't care what you're running from. But if I'm going to have a guest in my cabin, I need to know if I should be expecting company. Because men who beat a woman like that, they don't like it when their problems survive." For a long minute, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the wind whipping against the log walls. Finally, Abigail set the cup down. The facade of the helpless stagecoach victim melted away, replaced by a hardened, bitter resolve. "Nathaniel Hayes," she said, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. Jeremiah frowned. He recognized the name. Hayes was a ruthless industrialist, a man who had been buying up vast tracts of land across the Colorado Territory, forcing out ranchers and miners with a private army of hired guns. "He's my husband," Abigail said softly, the admission clearly costing her. Or, he was. "I was a mail-order bride from Philadelphia, an arrangement made by my late father to settle debts. When I arrived in Denver, Nathaniel played the perfect gentleman, but beneath it, he's a monster." She shifted, grimacing in pain. "He doesn't just buy land, Mr. Cross. He slaughters the families who refuse to sell. I found out. I found the ledger where he keeps the records of the payments to his assassins, the Pinkertons, the bounty hunters. The exact dates, the names of the murdered families. It's enough to hang him 20 times over." "And you tried to run with it," Jeremiah guessed. "I thought I could make it to the federal marshal in Cheyenne," she whispered. "But his men caught me in the basin. They beat me. They dragged me to the edge of the ravine. Nathaniel himself delivered the final blow to my head." Her voice broke, a tear finally escaping and cutting a clean line through the grime on her cheek. "He told me he wanted me to feel the cold before the dark took me. He thought I was dead when they kicked me over the edge." Jeremiah felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. Nathaniel Hayes wasn't a local bandit. He was a man with endless resources, and if his men were thorough, they would eventually double back to confirm the kill. "They asked about the ledger," Abigail continued, her eyes locking onto Jeremiah's. "I told them I burned it in the stove before I fled." "Did you?" Abigail shook her head. With agonizing slowness, she reached down to the ruined, blood-stained skirts of her silk dress that Jeremiah had piled in the corner to burn later. She pulled the heavy fabric onto the bed and began tearing at the thick, embroidered hem of her petticoat. From between the layers of silk and horsehair, she pulled out a small, leather-bound book, no bigger than a deck of cards. "I sewed it into the lining," she said, holding it out to him. "This is the noose around Nathaniel Hayes's neck." Jeremiah stared at the little black book. It looked entirely harmless, yet it carried the weight of a dozen dead families and the immense wrath of a millionaire. "I need to go down to Miller's Crossing," Jeremiah said abruptly, turning away from the bed. "We need more bandages, and I need to hear the talk. If Hayes thinks you're dead, we have time. If he knows you're missing." "You can't go down there," Abigail pleaded, panic rising in her chest. "If they see you buying supplies for a woman—" "I've been buying women's soaps and soft linen for a phantom wife for 5 years just to keep the locals from thinking I'm a complete savage," Jeremiah grunted, pulling his heavy buffalo coat back on. He checked the cylinder of his Colt revolver, the metallic click-clack echoing loudly in the small room. They won't suspect a thing. He walked to the door, his hand resting on the iron latch. He looked back at the battered woman sitting in his bed, clutching the black ledger like a shield. "Keep the door barred, Abigail. Don't open it for anyone but me. And keep that shotgun on the table loaded." With that, Jeremiah stepped out into the howling white wilderness, leaving Abigail alone with the ghosts of her past. But as Jeremiah rode down the mountain, the falling snow covering his tracks, he didn't realize that Hayes's men hadn't gone back to Denver. They were already at Miller's Crossing. and they were asking about a mountain man on an Appaloosa. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets by the time Jeremiah's gelding trudged into Miller's Crossing. The town was little more than a muddy artery of timber-framed saloons and a single mercantile clinging desperately to the side of the mountain. Smoke choked the freezing air, reeking of cheap coal and stale whiskey. Jeremiah tied Barnaby to the hitching post outside Cobb's Provisions. He pulled his hat low over his eyes, masking his face in shadow, and pushed through the heavy wooden doors. The bell above chimed a weak, pathetic note. The warmth of the potbelly stove in the center of the room was a welcome relief, but the atmosphere inside was anything but warm. Ezekiel Cobb, a balding, twitchy man who usually talked the ear off anyone willing to listen, was silently sweeping the same spot of floor behind the counter. His eyes darted nervously toward the back of the store. Jeremiah didn't need to look to know they weren't alone. He felt the shift in the room, the subtle scrape of boot leather against the floorboards, the quiet click of a thumb easing the hammer of a revolver back a fraction of an inch. He kept his pace steady, walking to the counter. "Ezekiel," Jeremiah rumbled. "Need a bolt of clean linen, carbolic soap, and 10 pounds of coffee." Ezekiel swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Jeremiah, you're down the mountain early. Storms brewing fierce." "I need the supplies, Ezekiel." A harsh, grating voice echoed from the shadows near the pickaxes. "Linen and carbolic soap. Odd provisions for a mountain hermit." 2 men stepped into the lantern light. They weren't local miners or drifters. They wore heavy, tailored wool coats and expensive bowler hats that hadn't seen enough frontier dirt. The speaker, a man with a jagged scar running from his ear to his jawline, smiled a cold, dead smile. Jeremiah recognized the type immediately. Pinkerton dropouts, hired muscle willing to do the devil's work for a rich man's coin. "Name's Cutter Boone," the scarred man said, his hand resting lazily on the butt of a pearl-handled Smith & Wesson. The second man, a stocky brute with a broken nose, fanned out to Jeremiah's right, cutting off the exit. "My associate, Josiah Gentry, and I are looking for a woman. Red hair, city clothes. Ran off into the basin a few days ago, sick in the head. Have you seen anything, big man?" Jeremiah didn't flinch. "Ain't seen nothing but snow and pine trees." Boone stepped closer, close enough that Jeremiah could smell the chewing tobacco on his breath. That's a shame, because a local tracker, fellow by the name of Landon Reed, swore he saw heavy boot prints leading an Appaloosa up the ridge from the basin, a horse exactly like the one hitched outside. Boone's eyes dropped to Jeremiah's boots. "And I see dark stains on your stirrup leathers out there. Looks like dried blood." Jeremiah's mind raced. If they had spoken to Landon Reed, they already knew where his cabin was. "My gelding took a nasty scrape on some shale," Jeremiah lied smoothly, his muscles coiling like a trapped mountain lion. "Is that so?" Josiah sneered from the door. "Why don't we ride up to your little shack and see for ourselves?" "Nobody goes to my cabin," Jeremiah growled. "It wasn't a request," Boone snapped, drawing his pistol. But Jeremiah was already moving. In a blur of sheer explosive violence, he grabbed the heavy glass jar of pickled eggs from the counter and smashed it squarely into Boone's face. The hired gun screamed as vinegar and glass blinded him, his pistol discharging wildly into the ceiling. Josiah raised his rifle, but Jeremiah dove behind the counter, drawing his Colt in a fluid motion. He fired blindly through the thin pine wood of the counter. A heavy thud and a gurgling gasp told him his aim was true. Josiah hit the floorboards, a dark pool spreading beneath him. Boone was on his knees, clawing at his bleeding face with his left hand while trying to aim his revolver with his right. Jeremiah vaulted the counter, his massive boot coming down hard on Boone's wrist. Bones snapped. Boone howled in agony. Jeremiah grabbed the man by the lapels of his expensive coat, lifting him entirely off the floor. "Who else is looking for her?" Jeremiah roared, shaking the man like a rag doll. You're dead, mountain man." Boone spat blood onto Jeremiah's coat. "The boss didn't stay in Denver. He took a private train to Oak Haven. He's already riding up the North Ridge with 6 men. You're too late! A cold dread seized Jeremiah's heart. Nathaniel Hayes was here, and they were attacking the cabin from the blind side of the mountain. Jeremiah dropped Boone with a crushing right hook to the jaw, leaving him unconscious on the floor. He didn't bother waiting for Ezekiel Cobb to emerge from hiding. He threw a gold eagle coin on the counter, grabbed his saddlebags, and bolted out the door. He threw himself onto Barnaby's back, kicking the horse into a frantic, dangerous gallop up the treacherous switchbacks. The blizzard was fully upon them now, a blinding wall of white that turned the world into a freezing void. Jeremiah prayed to a God he hadn't spoken to in years. "Hold on, Abigail. Just hold on." Back at the cabin, the silence was suffocating. Abigail, huddled near the cast-iron stove, the heavy double-barreled shotgun resting across her lap. Her ribs ached with a deep, pulsing agony, but the fever had subsided, leaving her with a terrifying clarity. The wind howled outside, rattling the heavy wooden shutters. Then she heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was the distinct, rhythmic crunch of snow under heavy boots. Not one man, several. Abigail's breath hitched. She forced herself to stand, ignoring the searing pain in her chest. She backed away into the deepest shadow of the cabin, leveling the heavy barrels of the shotgun at the thick oak door. "Abigail, my darling." The voice cut through the howling wind like a razor blade. It was smooth, cultured, and utterly devoid of humanity. "Nathaniel." "Open the door, Abigail," Nathaniel Hayes called out, his voice practically purring with cruel amusement. "It's freezing out here. You wouldn't want your lawful husband to catch his death, would you?" Abigail's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the weapon. "Go to hell, Nathaniel!" she screamed, her voice cracking. A low chuckle echoed from the porch. "I told you, my dear. You left a trail. Silk threads from a torn petticoat caught on the sagebrush. Blood in the snow. You always were horribly messy." The amusement vanished from his voice, replaced by cold fury. "Break it down." Two massive impacts hit the heavy door, splintering the wooden bar that held it shut. Abigail aimed at the center of the wood and pulled the first trigger. The 1-0 gauge shell exploded with a deafening roar, blowing a hole the size of a dinner plate through the door. A man screamed outside, followed by the sound of a body hitting the snow. "Bitch!" someone yelled. Rifle fire erupted, tearing through the windows and the thin pine shutters. Abigail dropped to the floor as glass and wood splinters showered over her. She coughed through the thick, acrid cloud of black powder smoke filling the small room. The door finally gave way, crashing inward off its hinges. Through the swirling snow and smoke stepped Nathaniel Hayes. He was impeccably dressed in a fur-lined sable coat, a silver-tipped walking stick in one hand, and a gleaming nickel-plated revolver in the other. Two hired guns flanked him, stepping over the body of the man Abigail had just shot. "You always were a fighter," Nathaniel sneered, stepping into the warmth of the cabin. "It's the one thing I admired about you. But this has gone on long enough. Give me the ledger." "You beat me to death for it," Abigail spat from the floor, struggling to swing the heavy shotgun up with her remaining strength. "Why would I ever give it to you?" "Oh, you naive little fool," Nathaniel sighed, stepping closer and kicking the shotgun out of her hands with a brutal swipe of his boot. She cried out as her fractured ribs flared in agony. "You thought I cared about a little black book of names? The Pinkertons and the law are in my pocket. That ledger is an annoyance, nothing more." He leaned down, grabbing her roughly by the auburn hair and pulling her face up to meet his. "I married you because your idiot father didn't just have debts. He owned the original mineral rights to the entire Oakhaven Valley. A silver vein worth millions, sitting right under my nose. But the rights passed to his blood heir. To you." Nathaniel smiled, cocking the hammer of his revolver. "Under territorial law, if my beloved wife dies a tragic death in the wilderness, those rights pass directly to her grieving husband. I didn't want the book, Abigail. I just needed you dead." He pressed the cold steel barrel against her forehead. "Goodbye, darling." Crack. It wasn't Nathaniel's gun that fired. The front window shattered inward completely, as a heavy slug tore through the skull of the hired gun standing to Nathaniel's left. The man crumpled instantly. Nathaniel whipped around just as a massive, snow-covered figure charged through the broken doorway. Jeremiah Cross didn't look like a man. He looked like a force of nature, an avalanche of muscle and fury. Before the remaining hired gun could raise his rifle, Jeremiah slammed into him, driving a massive hunting knife deep into the man's chest. They crashed into the heavy wooden table, splintering it in half. Nathaniel stumbled backward, his composure finally breaking. He aimed his nickel-plated revolver at Jeremiah's broad back. "Die, you savage!" he screamed. He pulled the trigger. The bullet tore through the meaty part of Jeremiah's shoulder, spinning the big man around. Jeremiah grunted, dropping to one knee, his Colt knocked from his hand. Nathaniel laughed, stepping forward to finish the job. He aimed right between Jeremiah's eyes. He never saw Abigail move. Summoning the last desperate shred of her strength, she grabbed a jagged, 2-foot-long splinter of wood from the shattered table. With a feral scream, she drove the jagged stake deep into the back of Nathaniel's knee. The industrialist shrieked in agony, his leg buckling beneath him. His shot went wild, burying itself in the roof beams. That momentary distraction was all Jeremiah needed. He lunged forward, ignoring the burning pain in his shoulder. He grabbed Nathaniel by the throat with his massive, calloused hand, lifting the millionaire entirely off the ground. With a final, terrifying roar, Jeremiah slammed Nathaniel backward into the red-hot iron of the potbelly stove. The smell of burning sable fur and roasting flesh filled the cabin as Nathaniel Hayes screamed a sound that didn't even sound human. Jeremiah didn't let go until the thrashing stopped, and Hayes's lifeless body slumped to the floor, his empire of blood and silver ending in the ash of a mountain cabin. Silence rushed back into the room, broken only by the howling wind outside and the heavy, ragged breathing of the two survivors. Jeremiah clutched his bleeding shoulder, leaning heavily against the log wall. He looked down at Abigail. She was covered in soot, blood, and snow, shivering violently, but her emerald eyes burned with a fierce, unbreakable light. "You came back," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jeremiah slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor beside her. He reached out with his good arm, pulling her gently against his uninjured side. "I told you," he rumbled, his voice softening. "I tie up loose ends." They sat there in the ruins of the cabin, the storm raging outside, knowing they could never stay. Tomorrow, they would pack the ledger, the mineral deeds, and ride north for Cheyenne to tear down the empire Hayes left behind. But tonight, they had survived. The mountain man had found something worth fighting for, and the battered city girl had finally found a home that couldn't be broken. If this Wild West tale of betrayal, survival, and forbidden romance kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Don't forget to share this incredible story of resilience with your friends, and hit subscribe for more thrilling real-life historical dramas. Drop a comment below. Would you have braved the blizzard to save Abigail? Turn on notifications so you never miss our next epic adventure into the untamed frontier.
Hi, my name is Pham Nguyen, the owner and manager of Shattered Justice Echoes. After watching the video, she was beaten and left on the side of the road. A mountain man found her and brought her home. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the strength Abigail found after everything she endured, and the quiet compassion Jeremiah showed when he chose to help a stranger without expecting anything in return.